The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. I, of course, am one of your hosts, Greg, who knows very little about Wheel of Time, although it's increasing ever more. And I, of course, am joined fresh from a trip on the Galactic Star Cruiser and even fresher from a batch of COVID. It's Tylor. Hello, Tylor.
Hey, it turns out that Florida is a wonderful place to do lots of things, including catch diseases. No offense to those of you from Florida, but lots of offense to those of you from Florida. Greg, how are things going for you?
Things are good. I mean, I keep threading the needle on COVID. So every time another one of my brothers in arms who's survived this long without it falls, I just feel like my days are numbered. But my son and I did a local Comic-Con this weekend, and we were like the only two people in masks. And I will give my wife a lot of credit. She didn't tell me we had to wear masks, but as soon as I posted photos of the two of us in masks, she was like, "Oh, thank God you wore masks." Well, anyway, that's some of our local adventures. We won't get too far down that road, but instead save our energy, voices, and lack of coughing for some Wheel of Time discussion. So this is the week where we are discussing chapters 29, Eyes Without Pity, and 30, Children of Shadow. Two Perrin chapters. I was very surprised that we didn't change group of characters. And I will say I'm not smart enough to know if it's the first time. I don't think it is that we've had two consecutive chapters, but it might be the first time they've fallen in the episode that way. I think previously we did one and then the other across two episodes.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I always in my head in this book in particular kind of think of them as Rand chapters and non-Rand chapters. And we've definitely had two non-Rand chapters together, but I think you're right. It was one Nynaeve and one Perrin. So I am very much loving our time away from just being in Rand's head. I will say one of the things I struggle with the most about this first book of the series is just how much Rand there is. So I appreciate a little bit of a vacation from him. And while we're preparing for that, actually, we have, before we even dive into chapter 29, Eyes Without Pity, just a little bit of ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast. I would like to draw our attention to the chapter icon at the beginning of chapter 29. This is the wolf chapter icon, which we actually briefly talked about in the previous episode. But today I want to make sure we have a little bit of an opportunity to talk about the art and what we think in terms of symbolism. So, Greg, I realize that I am springing this upon you with no warning, but what were your thoughts about this kind of first kind of glimpse at this image before we kind of dive into the deep details?
So I flipped quickly to it because I couldn't even recall what it was. But, I think this one is kind of beautiful in its simplicity. We have the wolf in black and then with the white outline. But I will tell you the thing that I still love most about the wolf and Elias and all that is I still go back to that description of Dapple's name. And so I'm looking kind of behind the wolf and, they've created a horizon there in the woodcut design. And it almost looks to me like a shoreline or the edge of a pool. So my mind goes right to Dapple. And I just feel like that's a celebration of her and her very long, intricate identity. Seems like it would make a good tattoo or a good t-shirt, being kind of simple and not a like Dwight from The Office wolf t-shirt. And I don't want to spoil the rest of our conversation tonight, but it makes me wonder, are we going to see more of this Mark, or is this kind of the end of this Mark? So that's part of where my thinking is initially.
Yeah, and I think I was originally going to highlight one of the things that you did also, which is that line of light kind of behind the wolf. And what's interesting to me is that every one of these symbols that we've looked at so far, we've really talked about kind of the duality of light and dark in them, right? Well, we've talked about shading and color and all of that. And what's interesting to me about this symbol is that it's so dark and so black. And then we get this one line of light that actually isn't part of the wolf at all. It's just the area behind it. And so I kind of read that you said, you described it as being a horizon. I kind of read it specifically as like a horizon at twilight or early in the morning, right? That moment where the sky is dark and the land is dark, but there's just that little line of brightness. And so given how much we've been talking about the light and the dark and the balance in all of these icons, I think it's really interesting to me that this is the first one that seems to lean really far into the dark side of that duality, which, given what we know about the Wolf brothers and how much they dislike Trollocs and all of that, actually feels a little bit outside of the way that wolves have been described so far. So I think it's kind of an interesting symbol just in terms of how the symbolism lines up with what we've actually seen at play so far in the book.
Yeah, and there's clearly a moment at the end of the second chapter for tonight where there's, some characters who I don't think we should necessarily trust, but they're just immediately like, wolves are of the dark, right? Yeah. So everything you're describing is true visually here, and it is striking that it's all dark, and it's the dark that stretches out of the frame as well. Yeah. And so with that thought, it's like, well, is there something to that? Again, could we potentially be misreading what's good and what's wrong? I'm still not prepared to leap that far, but I do think it's notable that Jordan is keeping that all in play.
Absolutely. And I think the one thing that I want to mention, just as we're kind of leaning into this icon, is we've always talked about symbolism, and I think we've done a good job here. But the other thing we've always talked about with these symbols is, what do they mean when you see them at the beginning of a chapter, right? And I think the wolf symbol, the obvious thing that is, what we're seeing here and what we will see at some point later on in the books, we're not just going to completely leave wolves behind forever. This symbol means that there could potentially be wolves in chapters. But the other thing that I think is interesting is that we've seen this symbol a few times before this in the book, I believe, even in chapters where wolves were very minor in terms of their prominence. And so this symbol, it actually turns out, is the personal symbol of Perrin Ibarra. And so when you see the symbol, it doesn't necessarily mean you can expect to see Dapple or Hopper or one of the wolves that we've become familiar with. You could also...
Don't I'm not ready for that discussion yet. We'll get there tonight, but
yeah, sorry, I'm not allowed to mention that name. I'll settle. But no, Perrin also is to some degree a wolf, at least when we're considering when this shows up at the beginning of the chapter, who's going to show up. He's on the list. And so this is going to be a thing that we'll see pretty frequently, in the same way I think we've mentioned a few times. We really like when series, you can kind of flip forward and see when's the next time this character is showing up. If you flip forward in these books and see a wolf chapter icon coming up, there's a very good chance Perrin is going to be the prominent character in one of those chapters.
Well, and I think part of what I wondered after reading these two tonight, it's like, oh, is his time as a wolf walker kind of ending? Because that relationship seems severed, at least where we leave them at the end of the second chapter. Again, I'm just previewing our discussion tonight. So that's also reassuring to me that remains a part of his identity, and, those abilities perhaps will fade but not disappear or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, let me just follow that up by saying that Moraine's chapter icon is a staff that I've repeatedly says vanishes forever. So don't get too confident about any of these predictions. But yeah, fair absolutely. Enough. I think this is a metaphor that's going to get played with a lot. And I think this is a good place to just dive straight in to the summary of chapter 29, Eyes Without Pity, which highlights something that we've mentioned once or twice briefly, but I think this is the ideal chapter to remind viewers, while this is a fantasy series, it's kind of a fantasy horror series in these first few books. And this chapter really highlights it. We begin with Elias's whole demeanor being changed since they've left the Tuatha on. He seems anxious and really rushing to try to get them somewhere. I think Perrin even says it's like he's trying to make up for all the time that they lost with the Tinkers. Elias can't really put a finger on what he's worried about until eventually, after dodging around some hilltops and taking the long ways around, he and Perrin eventually spot a flock of ravens who seem to be flying from perch to perch and seem to be either torturing or murdering animals along the way. And the descriptions of this are not fun and kind of horrifying. And it really does a good job, I think, of building up the tension throughout this chapter as they're kind of rushing and, really running out of options. Eventually, it turns out that not only are there ravens in front of them, but there are ravens behind them. And Elias actually strategically doesn't say anything about it until Perrin basically admits in front of Egwene that he felt what was going on behind them and is aware that the wolves are being attacked by the ravens. Eventually, the group does finally make it into a place of safety, what Elias refers to as an Ogier steading, a place where evil does not enter and a place where the one power, it seems, doesn't work. Once they finally make their way to some water within the steading, they then basically have a brief discussion about a weird rock they find, which is in the shape of an eye. And so we get a bit of background about the king, Arthur Pendrag Tenrial, and we get all of the detail about his disdain for the Aes Sedai, his want to build a city in an Ogier steading that would be protected from the one power, and eventually how he sent an army across the ocean, but then when he died, he could have been saved by an Aes Sedai, but refused it, eventually creating the War of 100 Years, where his kingdom fell apart as all of his descendants battled among one another to try to take control of the area. So it's kind of a chase chapter and then a lore dump. And so I'm curious, Greg, what your thought was on this chapter, which I think kind of does, almost the second half of it feels more like the next chapter we're going to be discussing rather than, the big chase that we get throughout most of it.
Yeah, I read this a couple of days ago now, or maybe it was just yesterday. Time is a flat circle. But I think I had kind of done exactly what you just said. I'd kind of thought of all of this as the back half of the chapter, and it's more connected to that next piece. Although there is a major shift in the middle of the next chapter too.
Yeah.
So, I think I feel like I'm a broken record, but I was totally in Lord of the Rings vibes here, because there's a great scene in Fellowship of the Ring, the movie, where the crows, in that case of Saruman, come and they all quickly duck under rocks, and then the kind of storm cloud. It's such a good rewatch moment in the movie, because it always takes just like a couple seconds longer before the birds rush past the camera, and it's coming, but it kind of always makes you half jump. So I immediately thought of that. But to your point from your description, it's a lot more graphic and a lot darker in this description, and especially the description of the fox that just gets eviscerated, really kind of literally. So that was probably the standout of the early half of the chapter. But I will say, before I toss it to you, I'll say the thing that will last with me from that, the lore dump, interesting. I have some questions, but the thing that will really last for me is Perrin was mentally preparing himself to kill Egwene, and I don't think that was the wrong choice. And yet it is a very different move for that character. And it made me wonder, what's pushing him that far? Is this realistic understanding of the world and how dark the world can be, and so he needs to be ready to do dark things? Or is there a shadow on him of some kind, and is having these dreams and experiencing the things he's experiencing there just making kind of darker paths feel more correct in some way?
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, especially given that Perrin is the only one of our kind of like core four Emmons Fielders who isn't a farmer, right? There's a part of me that if you gave that moment to, to Rand or to Matt, I feel like it would have been couched in like culls happen on the farm,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like if you are a shepherd and there is a baby sheep that is not going to make it, you do what you have to do. But Perrin's a blacksmith, right? That's not something that he's grown up doing. It's not something he's been around in the same way that I think the others have. And so it was really interesting from my perspective because it feels very un-Perrin. And, so I think you're exactly right to be asking these questions about, is it just the pressure that they're under? Is it just how truly horrific what they were seeing were? And your, kind of thing that you jumped to was the Lord of the Rings, which is interesting because it should have been what I jumped to. But my brain went to a very different, much more horrifying place. I don't know whether you're familiar with Lars von Trier's Antichrist.
No.
But it is a horrifying horror film that includes a disemboweled fox speaking one of the weirdest lines I've ever seen a disemboweled fox speak. And that's
that
what
old
immediately
trope
jumped to my
just,
mind.
yeah. Oh man. Well, we could unpack that further, but I don't want to get our mature rating on the podcast. So well, and the one other thing that I should say was a candidate in my mind, which I didn't articulate just now, was it's also, is it the wolf influence? Is he just a member of a pack now? And, I don't know enough about wolf ecology. I actually have a really good friend who just got his PhD in wolf ecology. So maybe I'll call him. Sure. He got his PhD in, I think it was technically classified as geography, but it was, an environmentalism study on wolf and wolf behavior. So, anyway, so it makes me wonder, well, packs, we think of animals as having just some natural brutality to them. I don't know that wolves in particular kind of kill the weak or anything like that, but it does make me wonder, is this also having effect on him? And all of this combined, and I really did like that point you just made about, he is the blacksmith. It's like, well, it doesn't feel like we're that far into this adventure, but we're far enough that people are being changed by the events and things are happening. And that just makes me realize kind of how far that we have come, or how far they've come, more literally. So it felt to me like at the beginning of this, like Perrin's wolf powers were growing again. And there was a bit of conflict between Egwene and Perrin as she's kind of really becoming conscious of how this is happening. And she seems really unnerved by it. And that means they're both kind of unnerved by the other, right? That he hates her growing Aes Sedai powers and she hates his growing wolf powers. And so, I think we've seen that dynamic before, and we've talked through some of their tension, but it seems like, well, they've each had to choose to recognize a part of who they are, and that change is really affecting their relationship. I mean, that is, that's called puberty, but it also just is a reminder that, the small choices we make that seem like they're not a major choice are what create the cracks that cause the breaks in our relationships and I don't know, that got oddly philosophical, but I do think it is nice to see that it's happening in the character. And it just feels like that while this is a small gap at the moment, the water's getting in and it's going to keep spreading and spreading.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, given that in my mind, Egwene and Perrin are actually reacting to their kind of budding powers in very different ways, right? Because while you're exactly right, I think Egwene doesn't quite know what to make of these, wolf powers and seems a little bit overwhelmed by whatever's going on with Perrin. And the reverse is also true. Internally, the reactions of the characters really couldn't be that much more different, right? Because it seems, at least from what we're seeing, we haven't been in Egwene's head since the prologue, but she certainly seems to be pretty quickly embracing these Aes Sedai abilities that she has, and as actually the only one of the Emmons Fielders who has just kind of been Moraine, the powers you're using, they might not seem great, but I'm down with them, right? She just immediately jumps on board. She believes Moraine's teaching. She's in. And Perrin has been very kind of resistant to the powers building up in himself, right? He's worried about whether the wolf will take over or whether, what he's doing is unnatural or evil. And so it's very interesting to me that Egwene seems to be willing to kind of give herself distance to see what these powers are and whether they're actually good or evil in terms of her own abilities, but then isn't quite allowing that for Perrin. She's afraid of what's happening to him, whereas what's happening to her, at least according to her own society, is way scarier. And she's just like, no, I think this is a great gift for me. And so that's, I think it's something we've all done, especially when we were the age that Perrin and Egwene are, right? Is we kind of give ourselves a little bit more grace than we're willing to give others. And I think it's interesting to see that, kind of play out here.
Yeah, it's like, what is she doing except, worshiping BTS or chasing the McRib state to state or whatever kind of adolescent obsessions we all get. Those are the two that come to mind, those two common.
Those were yours, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I really appreciate what you're saying. And I think that hadn't really kind of bumped for me because I still find myself just totally trusting Moraine for better or worse, despite all the warnings. So it's kind of like I see Egwene just naturally following the best path there is here. Whereas what's interesting to me about my own reaction there is that Elias is kind of established as kind of the same profile, right?
Yeah.
Special abilities we don't understand, way more knowledgeable about the world, ready to help, but kind of focused on a bigger picture. And yet I don't necessarily trust him as much as I do Moraine, for better or worse.
Yeah. And I think this is actually something that's interesting for me is when I was reading this book the first time, I kind of remember having that same reaction of Moraine trustworthy, Elias not necessarily. But at the same time, while I wasn't necessarily down with Elias, I have kind of always been in the dapple hopper wind. I believe those wolves, even if I don't entirely trust Elias. And that's an interesting place to be for Perrin, right? It's this interesting, natural, seemingly positive thing with this very gruff, possibly evil looking kind of person being their spokesperson.
Yeah. I'm there too. I trust the wolves. And is it because they're natural? I think, well, in this chapter, we get wolves versus fox, right? And traditionally speaking, foxes are crafty and tricksters and not strong, whereas the wolves here are capable and strong and in control. So even though wolves are a greater threat to humanity or what have you, I do think there's a way in which they're more admirable. And so I trust them. And again, you're the biggest dog guy. I almost said God guy. You brought up the Antichrist. So you're the biggest dog guy in the world as of 4 years ago or wherever. So I think it's natural you kind of trust the dogs, right? And I mean, who doesn't love a good dog story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds like a very good hypothesis, even though dogs scare me if they're higher than my near. So the other thing I did want to mention, this is a good place to just key in on it. I haven't mentioned it 3 or 4 times throughout the series, but dogs don't like Egwene and dogs don't like Moraine. And maybe keep an eye on that just because you brought up dogs.
Interesting. I know from playing Skyrim, you should always pet the dog as you enter into the town. But if they're running from you, you don't chase them down. So, okay. Interesting. Good to think about. Well, the other Lord of the Rings thing, and I always mean that in a complimentary fashion, is this statue, which is present in the Lord of the Rings books, that there's just this fallen society in the deep past of Middle Earth, and it's there. I know it's much more prominent on the minds of people who have Amazon Prime right now. I have not seen the new show, but I know it's dealing with the Second Age.
Correct.
Yeah. So, and so one of the things I love about Peter Jackson's movies is that it's there, and they don't talk about it even. It's like, you know, at the end of the first movie, they're up on the hill there, and there's just like ruins of a stone, you know, building of some sort. And there are times, I think it's at the end of Two Towers, or maybe it's the beginning of Return of the King, where Frodo and Sam come across like great statues buried in the trees that orcs have desecrated, and so on. So when we get to this Arthur Hawk King, I'm not going to remember the whole thing, but we have this statue that, you know, is here seemingly as a giant reminder that glory fades, that you can be literally the coolest person in the world, the biggest hero in the world, and eventually your statue falls. And I like that in my fantasy, both because it establishes deep time and it reminds you not to get too caught up in the moment of any of your current heroes. And I think Lord of the Rings used it that way, and this uses it this way as well.
Yeah, and I will say I appreciate that sort of like idea of deep time in Tolkien, but I hate the way Tolkien developed his deep time, which is like vaguely reference it 3 times in the main book and then write a giant 800-page outrigger that no one wants to read ever.
Yeah.
Please don't read the Silmarillion. It's not worth your time.
To me, I agree. To me, that's the book you write so that you can write your books, but you never release that book. And I'm not an expert on this. I know Tolkien doesn't have total control over all his papers and his estate, and his son has clearly made a name for himself from that. But it does seem like, that's the book you write, so you have a really great story, and then well, again, tell it to me like it's Star Wars. We're about to get these Tales of the Jedi, which Dave Filoni has said, like, I had to figure out Ahsoka's backstory and Count Dooku's backstory in ways different than you need to see, so I just made these sketches, and turns out they're going to be fantastic little shows, he says. Anyway, so but I'm in the camp of like, write that so I get to see the benefits of it, but I don't want to read that at all.
Well, and that's why I'm so impressed with Robert Jordan repeatedly in this series, is because he manages to fit all of the information that was in the Silmarillion in, you know, Lord of the Rings land into little bits of backstory like this, right? Where you've got like 10 pages and you're just going to learn a little bit more about Arthur Hawkwing, who lived 2,000 years ago, and maybe it will be relevant at some point, I guess, right? And unlike Tolkien, who I feel like I am just not enjoying reading his 2,000-year-old stories, Jordan finds a way to make me feel like I'm, you know, the archaeologist digging up this little piece of history and learning a nugget that I want to keep with me. And I think it's just a little bit more effective here. Maybe that's just me not liking Tolkien's writing as much, but I appreciate the way Jordan pulls it off.
Well, and you know, the metaphor I'd use for what you just said is like you're finding the shards of pottery and reconstructing whatever pot you imagine them to be, whereas Tolkien's like, hey, here's the pot. So that, I think, it means it's more participatory, and it's also less well defined, so you get to fill in the gaps in the way that works the best for you, as is beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. That was kind of all I had in this chapter, at least, right? It kind of blurs a little bit into the next, but was there anything else that you wanted to make sure we talked about when it comes to ravens and Arthur Hawkwing?
Just a couple clarifications on this lore dump at the end. So this is not the first time we've heard about Arthur Hawkwing, and it is very clearly derivative of Arthur Pendragon of, you know, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So another, and that was when we heard about him before, right? In that initial kind of, might be our world hint.
Yes, so we heard about him in the This Might Be Our World, Tom telling all the stories. The other time we've heard his name dropped is, I think, once or twice in Dreams. Baal-Zaman has made reference to Arthur Hawkwing.
And so I'm intrigued by that, and I was curious and interested how that's going to work. I also noted, and this is where I'm just going to show my whole ass on what I don't know. So then we have the War of 100 Years, which obviously is kind of a flipping around of the 100 Years' War, which in British history is not King Arthur times.
Correct.
That is later. That's in like the 1600s to 1700s.
I do not know that era of history at all.
I'm
fought some stuff.
Yeah, I'm really bad at British history. I'm totally a jingoistic Americanist, and when it comes to my knowledge of history. So to me that, but anyway, kind of pulling those shards together in my pot, I was like, oh, this is how it really works. That in the moment, these feel like whole separate eras. And how could you confuse these two things that come 300 years apart? But then all of us today are just like, yeah, Mesopotamia, it happened. Like Babylonians, Mesopotamians, all the different names that I'm forgetting, like they were all basically the same, even though it's like 3,000 years of history or what have you. So I liked that as just a way to be like, this, but it's not the way you know it, or kind of that type of gesture.
Yeah. And I think this is a really effective tool for Robert Jordan too, to also show us what has and what has not been lost, right? Because when we heard versions of these stories from Tom, he was emphasizing specific events and specific moments. And now we get, not from the perspective of a storyteller or a historian, we're now getting Elias's telling of this tale, which is just like, there was a dude, he was powerful, he died, right? And so to me, there's also something about who's telling the story and what gets remembered that's really interesting going on here.
Yeah, and so I'll just do the inarticulate final point of just like, it was really cool. Like, I just really like the statue, and I like the idea that the stone is actually an eye, and that it's so unnerving to just see a giant eye. Actually reminded me of Rogue One, right? On Jeddah, they're the big Jedi statues kind of laying there, and nobody ever acknowledges them in the course of that film. They're just there. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. So now I'm satisfied, just confirming my vague memories of, God, like 3 months ago now when we read that initial. We're getting to the point where I was feeling bad about my memory being bad, but now I'm not feeling so bad because it has been a significant amount of time since we read the initial pieces of this chapter, or this book. So chapter 30, Children of Shadow. Take us on.
Yes. So this chapter begins with Perrin reflecting on the day and Elias's misunderstanding of what Perrin was intending to do with Egwene and his axe, right? It turns out that Elias was worried that Perrin was going to kill Egwene because he hated her or she was slowing them down. Once he explains what was actually going on, however, Elias seems to understand and almost be encouraging of the idea of, she would have appreciated the mercy of what he was considering doing. Suddenly, however, there's a strong sending from the wolves. It soon becomes apparent that a large number of humans have been making their way directly towards the water that they are camping at. And Elias begins rapidly kind of breaking down the camp and trying to get them to run, and eventually sends Perrin and Egwene on their own while he and the wolves try to hide or distract these humans. It becomes apparent that the humans who have arrived are white cloaks and that they have some sort of issue with wolves. Eventually, it becomes obvious that they think that wolves are evil in some way. Eventually, they spot, I think it's Dapple is the first one that they see. And so we get this interesting scene of Perrin kind of running and trying to find a place to hide. They end up sheltering in Arthur Hawkwing's hand from the statue. And at the same time, Perrin is seeing glimpses of kind of a battle between the wolves and the humans from the perspective of the wolves, and how they're kind of effectively able to use darkness and surprise to kill a number of white cloaks. Eventually, the white cloaks do track down Perrin and Egwene in the hand, and as the white cloaks try to apprehend them, Hopper jumps out of nowhere and rescues Perrin by killing one of the white cloaks, but then Hopper is himself killed. Perrin becomes extremely angry and eventually blacks out. And when he comes to tied up in a tent with two white cloaks. I believe we only get their last names, not their first. Bayer and Bornhold. Bayer being much more young and seemingly, kind of very devoted to the cause, whereas Bornhold seems much more considering and willing to think through the process. They briefly interrogate Perrin and Egwene, who give a mostly true but somewhat falsified story. The big thing that they leave out from their story is Elias, who is replaced by a wandering warder in the telling. However, Bornhold soon reveals that while he believes many of the things that they're saying, he knows the world well enough to know, for example, the two rivers rivers are near Berlin, and so he accepts that might be where they're from. He doesn't buy a few of the additions that they've made to the story. He doesn't accept some of the things that they've said, and so he eventually tells them, Egwene, you better learn to tell the true story, or else you're going to have to go under the question. But Perrin, there's probably not much that can be done for you. You'll eventually be hanged for killing 2 of the White Cloaks. And that's where we leave things at the end of this chapter. So it's a pretty hard right turn from the kind of body horror, the birds that we saw in the previous chapter. But what do you think of this very different painting of evil that we're seeing in the White Cloaks?
I can't start there. I have to start here. Out of the night, Hopper came, and Perrin was one with the wolf. Hopper, the cub who had watched the eagles soar and wanted so badly to fly through the sky as the eagles did. The cub who hopped and jumped and leaped until he could leap higher than any other wolf, and who never lost the cub's yearning to soar through the sky. Out of the night, Hopper came and left the ground in a leap, soaring like the eagles. Well done, Mr. Jordan.
Yeah.
Sobbing in my living room over a fake wolf that wasn't even the main wolf we got to know. So, yeah, I mean, again, a thing that has stood out about Robert Jordan is that when he wants a sudden tone shift that the characters experience as abrupt and upsetting, he makes it abrupt and upsetting for us. And that's not a small skill, right? That every time I get comfortable in a pattern of they camp and everything's fine, we get a kind of surprise interruption to that. And so I found all of that highly effective. And then I will just say that it was, for me, I know we've obviously talked before about White Cloaks and how they are kind of a perversion of what seems to be true. And for me, it was just like, as soon as they appeared, I knew it was bad news, and everything they said, I was just like, nope, you're wrong. So I'm concerned and worried, but it was a way to flesh them out, but not at all make me question what we'd previously learned about them.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting scene with the White Cloaks, because it's the first time that we see them as individuals rather than as, a scary mob, or, I think the least we've seen of them in one place so far is like 5 or 6 at the gates of Berlin, is maybe the only time that we've really seen specific White Cloaks interacting before. And so for me, what's so interesting about this scene is that in the same way that we kind of have a feeling for like the wolf pack, and then every once in a while we get to pull out to like, you talked earlier about the description of Dapple's name, or now we learn what Hopper's name means, and it's, powerful and then gone. And then we get the same thing here with Bayer and Bornhold, who are 2 very different villainous characters, but both come across as kind of realistically and believably, they drink the same Kool-Aid, even though they are very different people. And I think that's something that Robert Jordan does a really effective job of, is painting with a really effective broad strokes what groups look like, and then pulling out really indicative individuals to fit within those groups. And I think that works in this chapter really effectively, both with Hopper and then also with this kind of glimpse of this new evil that we're seeing.
Yeah, so I will only correct you insofar to say that we do get Bornhold's name, Jeffrem, in this chapter. So, and I happen to have written that down in my notes because I thought Jeffrem Bolthord was Bornhold was such a great fantasy name.
It is a good name.
I feel like I really want to lift Jeffrem for the next D&D character I have to write. And so I agree with what you just said. And to me, it's an old cliche at this point, but the idea that if you want to write a villain, he or she has to believe what they are acting on. There's not actually like a Snidely Whiplash who's just like, I'll be evil to be evil. Like, they have to believe deeply in what they want.
Yeah.
And I think these guys, like you just said, when you zoom in on them, you get that and you understand the logic, even if you don't agree with the logic. It's also interesting because their presentation is so sure of themselves, and they act, straight on their beliefs, on what they think is proper. And that stood in contrast to me. I have a note here in my notes. The beginning of the chapter, there's Perrin, who's got this kind of what I wrote in my notes as endearing self-doubt. He's still not sure of himself. He's like, could I actually have killed Egwene? I don't think I could have. So whenever he gets kind of that built up as a hero, this is also where he's self-conscious about his axe, right? He's like, this isn't a real axe. This is just a farmer's tool or whatever. So I find that to be endearing, and I continue to latch onto those characters because that's the most human of emotions. We're not positive in what we're doing. We're doing the best we can to muddle through. Is that a Christmas Carol, right? Until then, we'll have to muddle through somehow. So we're doing our best to muddle through somehow. And so it's the people who act on such strong conviction that worry me. Now, I'm sure some listeners like, didn't you just say Moraine and like you're a friend? And fair enough, right? That when somebody acts so sure, I have to believe they are adhering to some kind of dogma that I only hope is good. And I worry that it's not.
Yeah, and I think actually, as we're talking through this, a really good example of this actually comes with Perrin doubting himself in the axe, right? Because the way that Elias describes Perrin's conflict within himself, I think is the kind of thing that fits exactly with the way that you're describing the White Cloaks. I'm paraphrasing here, but Elias says something about the axe like, you'll use it, and as long as you hate using it, you'll use it more wisely than most men would. Wait, if you ever don't hate using it, then will be the time to throw it away. And that feels like exactly the metaphor that you're building, right? Is Perrin has that self-doubt, and that's why he's a good person. That's why we want to be in his head and see how he thinks about these things. Joffrey Bornhold doesn't worry about using the axe, right? If he thinks that Perrin has killed some White Cloaks, he's just going to hang him. That's just how it works. And so I think you're right to identify that self-doubt as being really important. And it fits exactly in this metaphor of the axe that Perrin's kind of grappling with, right? How much is he a farmer versus a warrior versus a woodsman? And what does that mean for this tool he's holding? I don't think Joffrey Bornhold has worried about his axe in a decade, and that means he might not be the person you want with an axe.
Well, and just to throw in the mix there, then also, the way of the leaf, and that he's been exposed to this philosophy of nonviolence, and it's not exactly what he's thinking of here, but it's like, we have arrayed before Egwene and Perrin in particular all these different philosophies, and whereas there are extremes there, the way of the leaf being the pacifistic extreme, and then the White Cloak seeming to be the violent extreme. Elias is describing the kind of ideal middle path there, which is you use it because you have to, and as soon as you don't have to but still want to, get rid of it. Just what you read. So and I think that to me is a good hero definition as well, right? Like in the kind of classic archetype that, a hero is somebody who will do violent deeds but doesn't want to do them, offers his enemy the chance to surrender. I mean, that's the Jedi. That's, a lot of these figures. So,
well, and I think it's an interesting place too to put Wolfman, right? Because I don't think we really think in general of wolves as being creatures of great restraint, right? They're pack hunters. They go, they find something, they kill it, they eat it. But I think there is also something to be said for the fact that when you're living in kind of that natural world the way Elias is, there is something of a balance, right? Your pack can't just kill every deer in the area, because then there's no baby deer, right? And so the same way that we think of, like, the circle of life and whatever Lion King stuff we can talk about. No,
go ahead.
I was just going to say the same thing is basically true with wolves. So now howl that song and we're good to go.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting oddly into like wolf ecology again, but as I understand most animals, humans are the only ones who kind of glutton themselves, or domesticated animals that we've created now do. But just like you said, a maintaining of the balance. And I'll passingly throw another compliment at Robert Jordan, which is when the white cloaks do interrupt, we hear it first through the wolf language, and the idea of balance is right there, that there's something upsetting the balance, and that they smell dark like a rabid wolf, but not quite the same, right?
Yeah.
And so I really liked that. Again, we hear it through the wolves. We kind of really have this strong sense that the wolves can communicate a lot through the links and the smells and so on. And that only adds to the, okay, well, if this is an imbalance, it must be evil, it must be dark. So then when they go into describing everything as they see it, it's like, no, this is a perversion or an inversion of what we should be believing.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to jump back to the previous chapter, but one of my favorite kind of moments of that, like, wolf speak, what do you convey and how do you convey it, is in the previous chapter when Perrin is trying to figure out, will the ravens overtake us? Are we going to be able to make it to sundown? And he has to almost devise a way of communicating time to the wolves because they don't pay attention to the passage of time in the way that humans do. And so he devises this kind of like image of where the sun is on the horizon and where it's going to be when they're overtaken. And I just thought that that moment of Perrin kind of figuring out, how do I put this human concern into something the wolves will understand, was really effective and kind of taps into what you're describing in terms of how they communicate and how it's tied into all of these kind of pieces of nature that are kind of a part of a wolf pack.
Yeah, and again, that was so articulate. I don't have a lot to necessarily add to that, but it does make me even more concerned that we've seen kind of the end of this pack. I mean, Hopper gets that heroic moment, but then is just skinned, and it's brutal. And I'm as upset as Perrin is anyway. We really don't have a sense of what happened to the rest, as far as I can tell. They are either too far away or have shut off their wolf connection in some way, or I even kind of read it as Perrin just maybe rejoining the world of humans means he can't hear on that frequency as kind of society gets in the way again, or an imbalance upsets his balance in some way. And I mean, that's really all I had. I feel like I've said this 3 times, but it's like they go through such a complicated web. Oh, well, in your story, this means this and this means that. And just about at every turn, I was like, well, that's the opposite of what I think it should be. Those aren't the dark forces that you seem to think they are. And, you know, not to be controversial or too much of a hot take, but it did very much feel to me like the discussions I have with relatives now who are on the other side of the political spectrum, who we see the same facts, we just interpret them completely differently. We all hate inflation. They blame Joe Biden. I say, well, you know, it has to do with the pandemic supply chain and fuel prices based on Europe and the Ukrainian war. And they're like, yeah, but it sucks. And I hate Joe Biden. And it's like, we're dealing again with those same basic principles. And it's just a matter of interpretation. And, you know, I'm not going to give my relatives that much credit, but I will say that in the book, I think it does make it more of you have to choose a side, and the two sides are not going to necessarily be allies you like, right? Like these people are on the side of the light. You would like to be allies with them, and you can't be allies with them because they're such a twisted version of this.
Yeah, and I think that that's exactly the right metaphor to be drawing with the white cloaks, right? They are just such zealots, not religious zealots, but philosophical zealots, that anything that is presented to them, they are going to find a way to make it fit their worldview, right? I think the really good example of this is when they introduce into their story the warder that they supposedly met in Berlin, who like told them the name of Shadar Lagoth and told them about wolves and told them like 2 or 3 other things that their story otherwise wouldn't have had. And just to see how quickly Bornhold and Bayer are able to say like, oh, well, warders are associated with Aes Sedai, and Aes Sedai is evil, which means that everything he told you about must be evil, and anything that he said otherwise falls apart because warder. Like, that's the kind of conversation I feel like we've all had a dozen times, people on both sides of the political aisle. My advice for you, by the way, Greg, is just go get your PhD in economics. No one will want to talk with you about inflation ever again.
Yeah, fair enough. And Or I was also thinking in my head, I'm just like, man, I don't want Thanksgiving to get here. We're like 2 months away, and I'm still like, oh, I'm not looking forward to seeing those relatives. So maybe skip Thanksgiving and while getting my PhD in economics. And as I'm wrapping up my thoughts, just the classic, like, he, all of this seems a little twisted, but he doesn't seem like a bad guy. And then he's like, yeah, we'll figure things out. Oh, except for you, you're going to die.
Yeah.
And a really good note to end on. Again, one of those moments that makes you want to immediately find the next parent chapter. Although I think we're going to have a while before we get to that moment, because they're going to Camelin and then on to Amador, where
Correct.
he would be executed. Right.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. And so I'm quickly flipping to my map. Where is Amador?
It would be south of the two rivers, kind of in the southwest, central quadrant. Yeah.
Okay, so we're somewhere up in the Bran Wood, kind of up in there.
The Caroline grass is going to be the best description of kind of where we are at the moment, because we were originally at Shadar Lagoth, which is very difficult, if not impossible, to find on some versions of this map, because it once again lives right on the crease, kind of east of Berlon. But basically, we were told that our characters were going to accidentally be going from there straight east all the way across the mountain and not see anything the entire time. So presumably they were kind of in the Caroline grass, but if they had kept going east, they would have been south of Carrion. So they're maybe in like south third of the Caroline grass. I'm over analyzing the map at this point.
Well, and I'll just say, when you have a map this big, you're just waiting for them to go to all the far flung corners of it. And so I'm scared if they get dragged all the way back that way. That wasn't where I expected it to be. I expected it to be somewhere near Camelin. So I'm worried if they get dragged back. But then again, why do you have so many characters if not to split them up and then reunite them later and show how much they've grown and so on? So any other thoughts from you for this?
No, I think the only other moment in this chapter that I felt like mentioning, just because I thought it was a really fun moment, is when they're sheltering in the hand of Arthur Hawkwing. There's a moment where Egwene is trying to reassure Perrin. And Perrin's thought is, wait, why is Egwene trying to reassure me? I'm trying to reassure her. And that's just a moment that I think Robert Jordan does effectively quite a bit in these books, is he finds moments where two characters are both trying to be strong for the other. And we've all been in that moment. And it's always kind of reassuring to realize the other person thinks they're the strong one. So I just liked that moment. It made me smile. Any last thoughts from you before we sign off, Greg?
No, not really. We're headed straight away. I was just kind of looking at my book. This next chunk of the book will take us past page 500 in my edition, which means we're, really cruising right towards the end of this first novel. And I'm going to have to go buy my second one. And I'm excited to see. I'm wondering, I guess I'm starting to wonder how much gets wrapped up in this novel, how much is continuing on, as any fantasy series kind of has to find that balance.
And I think we can start the countdown. I actually did a quick count before we joined on today. We have 12 more episodes after today until this is done. So 4 months for those of you listening on a weekly basis. It sounds like a lot, but it's going to go fast.
Yeah, and I mean, that makes it ends up being kind of a 6-month project, probably, roughly a little longer than that, I guess. So next time, just your standard 2 chapters. Chapter 31, a play for your supper. I'm guessing a Tom chapter, but I didn't actually look. And chapter 32, 4 Kings in Shadow. And we're excited to continue the journey with you. We have started, per a very good suggestion, I tweeted out the art for the ill-advised discussion of a visual media and a non-visual object in a non-visual media. So I will try to do that. If you end up in the episode looking for something that we're discussing, you can find it on our Twitter account to see the exact version. I now realize I'm telling you this and it will have started like 4 weeks ago, but time is a weird thing when you're pre-recording podcasts. So, all right. Tyler, a pleasure as always. I hope you are fully on the mend, ready to soar like the eagles, as you always do.
That is not the encouraging thing to say. That wolf just died.
Well, either way, I will continue the podcast, and we will see you next time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.